Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you for being here today. My name is Isabel, and this is an event hosted on the We All Citizens platform. So if you're not a member of We All Citizens, it's weallcitizens.com or .org, and you can sign up and become a member. Quick plug. But this chat, we're gonna chat for an hour, and Ayo is our wonderful host, who I'll introduce in a second, but hopefully this time will be spent listening, getting uncomfortable, and hopefully learning some new things. So I'm first going to introduce my colleague, Lisa, who's going to provide some context for the call today. So Lisa, go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, I won't speak for long, but just to say hello on behalf of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and set a bit of the bigger context in which we're having this discussion today. So really exciting to see all of you, lots of people that I recognise and some new faces. Some of you are part of We All already as members or citizens, and you know us quite well, but some of you might have no idea what We All is and just thought this sounded like an interesting event. So for your benefit, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or We All for short, is a small non-profit organisation that exists to connect and amplify the movement for building a wellbeing economy. And we've got hundreds of members all over the world, many of them here. That's organisations, activists, citizens, we've even got governments in the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. And what all of those people and organisations have in common is commitment to helping bring about economic system transformation so that economies deliver human and environmental well-being. So a well-being economy, which is what we are trying to build, is designed with well-being of people and the planet at its core. And if you agree that that is what we need instead of the current economic systems, then as Isabel said, you're welcome to be part of We All and to connect with other change makers. And you can go to weallcitizens.org to find out more about that. So why are we having this event? I'm really excited about this today. I'm really excited to hand over to Ayo and learn from her. The reason that we are hosting this event as the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is because if we're serious as an organisation and as a movement about transforming our economic systems so that they deliver for everybody, then we also have to be serious about equity and about justice. Racial injustice is an economic problem. It's baked into our current economic model, and that's what we're trying to change. Those of us that are working to bring about that change have a responsibility to be proactively anti-racist, just as we have a responsibility to be proactively feminist and to really think about intersectional justice at all junctures. And that is really not easy. I wish it was easier. I'll be honest and say that I'm still learning in this space. My colleagues are still learning, our organisation's still learning, and I expect lots of you are as well. So that's what we're trying to do today. We're trying to learn out loud, I guess, and create spaces where people can learn together. We've always understood the need to tackle systemic racism, but we'll own the fact that until recently we probably hadn't been proactive enough, and we're trying to step that up a bit more, basically, and today's part of that. So we're super excited to have Ayo here as the host of today's event as part of that learning process. And there's a few members of the We All amplification team here alongside all of you listening and participating. And what we'll commit to do is to build the learnings and the outputs from today's conversation into our work going forward, because this is just a step on a journey, and we're really happy that you're here on that journey with us. So I'll go back to you now, Isabel.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And it is my pleasure to announce Ayo. She is an MIT trained chemical engineer. She was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and grew up in Miami, Florida. She's currently working and living in Stuttgart, Germany for Daimler AG, and previously worked for PowerGen, which is a leading mini-grid developer in Nairobi, Kenya. She's an amateur playwright, choreographer, poet, actress, and blogger, and her blog is toxicallyfeminine.com, so you can read more about her work there. So Ayo, may you take it away? And then also, actually, very quickly, for questions, please post your questions in the chat, and then I will unmute you to ask the questions as they come up. And please, again, turn your videos on if you do feel comfortable. And thank you again. So Ayo, take it away.
You have to unmute her, I think.
Yes.
The settings are such that the host can only unmute. But hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you guys could all come. I want to take a moment before we launch into a bit of a question portion to just set the stage, set the mood. I won't call this a safe space, but I want to call it a brave space. I also want to call it an ego-free space where we're going to get really comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think that is very important to growth, as many athletes and philosophers have told us. But that being said, please feel free to, we want this to be interactive as possible. So talk to us, say the things that are on your mind that you weren't sure if it was okay to say. I will personally be restraining any judgment. That being said, that does not mean that a thing you say to me today might not offend a different Black woman. So take all my lack of judgment with a grain of salt. And please just, let's do this. It's gonna be super fun. Things to remember: brave, ego-free. And now Isabel is going to run a poll with us, I believe.
Can everyone see the poll? Great. So the question is, which of these topics makes you feel most uncomfortable or unsure? And as you all vote, I'll get the results, and then that is how we're going to start our conversation today.
And scroll down. There's more than the first on the, yeah.
And we'll get through a couple of these. So it's mostly just going to be how we prioritize the discussion today. Okay. A couple more seconds here. All right. It looks like white supremacy in societal structures is the one that has the most votes at this time.
Nice. We shall address.
We shall address. And 36 of the 42 participants have voted. But I will, I'll keep it open just for a couple more seconds here. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Thank you all. And we'll start with white supremacy in societal structures.
Perfect. Isabel, can you share your screen?
I can.
Amazing. So we put together, and we're going to share this document with you guys after, but we put this together as sort of a starting point so that we're all using similar language, as we all know the power of language, and that we are all kind of on the same page about what certain things are and aren't. And so I love that this was the topic that was found most uncomfortable, because it was the first page of this document. And so I think a lot of times people are very okay with understanding interpersonal racism and how that is, not great, and being able to see it in themselves and in others and know when to call it out. But it's much, much harder to see institutional racism and structural racism. So I'm just going to read these out loud for the sake of our auditory and our visual learners. Let's do both. So we have oppression as a system, systematic subjugation, one social group by a more powerful social group for the social, economic, political benefit of the more powerful social group. I think I'm going to skip the second sentence because the most important part here is oppression equals power plus prejudice. And I think that's why when you see a lot of things about certain prejudices that other races that are marginalized have towards the more powerful one. And a lot of people say, oh, that's, reverse racism or something like that. And a really key point here is to remember that there's no power in that relationship. And so you have to have power to oppress someone, as well as your prejudice. And so interpersonal racism is when someone can take their misinformation, their stereotypes towards another group, perform an act of harassment, exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, lots of words that we all identify as not great. But the system of racism is much larger than these personal acts. And racism would not be eliminated by ending these individual acts. We can't just focus on individual rotten apples. We can't focus on that within the police debate. We can't focus on that within the larger racist system in general. We need to look at first institutional racism, which says it refers specifically to the ways in which institutional policies, procedures, practices create different outcomes for different racial groups. And racism is built into these policies and procedures in the healthcare system, the education system, the job market, the housing market, the media, and the criminal justice system. And so to operate both, and these all operate without the need of individual racist acts. They are going to exist as racist systems without you personally being racist, even if you work in a hospital, you know? And so some common examples are redlining, which is when government policies that explicitly restrict the ability of people to get loans or buy or improve their homes in neighborhoods with high concentrations of African Americans. Also, I will apologize in advance. A lot of my knowledge is heavily leaning towards the American system, but that does not mean that we are going to talk about it here in Europe as well. And then structural racism, the cumulative impact of interpersonal and institutional racism within our society. And so here's where these institutions overlap, reinforce, amplify each other. And you know, we're seeing it right now play out in real time with COVID-19, where the structural system that contributes to lower life expectancy of people, especially male people of color, African American, Native American, Hispanic, these systems are, as we've seen, killing marginalized groups and Black men and Black women at a higher rate. And it's the environmental toxins of, you know, we've heard of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where it's just where a lot of the oil drilling happens. It's where a lot of waste gets taken to, and they're taken there because the people in those communities do not have the power, political power, to lobby against those things happening in their communities. You see dangerous jobs, unhealthy housing stock. We saw that a lot of the essential workers in the US happen to be people of color. And so they're putting their lives at the front line of the pandemic while still having more lethal consequences, you know, having the fact of violence in their communities, the stress, the generational trauma of racism to also influence their health outcomes, combined with lower rates of healthcare coverage. You know, it's not just, I think a lot of times you take Medicare for all and racism as separate things, but health insurance is racial. And it's all part of this holistic structural racism. And then we also have the fact that there's the systematic refusal by the American nation to fix these things. But that was all a very long series of words. And as I said, I want this to not be me monologuing. I want this to be a dialogue. So now if you have a specific question on this topic of, you know, white supremacy in societal structures, please put it in the chat, and Isabel will unmute you and we can talk about it. No questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat, but I'm showing everyone the poll results as I had a request for the poll results to be shared. Don't be shy. You can either ask it just through your voice or in the chat as well.
Oh, we've got two. So there's role of history, and also Amanda wants to share something.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to unmute. Give me just a second. Okay, Sini, I've unmuted you if you'd like to ask your question.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I turned the camera on as well. Hi, everyone. I'm just wondering, I mean, I suppose it's sort of related issue is the kind of role of history in explaining why you know, why we have racism. You know, like things like, you know, what has happened in the past is at least partly the reason why we are where we are now. And I just find it a bit quite interesting that not very much of this has been talked about, but maybe it's just, you know, I'm new to the subject area. So just wanted to have people's thoughts in terms of, you know, whether history at least gives an explanation for why some races face discrimination and disadvantages over another.
Absolutely. Yes, the answer is yes. I think a really fun thing that I saw, and I'm going to keep quoting this, is the John Oliver's most recent piece on the police, where he says, if you want to know how we got here on purpose. A lot of how we have the culture that we have today is on purpose. And actually, one of the definitions, whiteness, Isabel, sorry, I keep making you go back and forth. One of the definitions, actually, I'll just read it myself, is on the topic of whiteness and where the concept of white even came from. So the term white, as to refer to people, was created by Virginian slave owners in the colonial times in the 17th century. And this was because it replaced terms like Christian and Englishman to distinguish the European colonists from Africans and indigenous people. So at the time, there was Bacon's Rebellion. This was 1676. And the indentured servants of both European and African descent had united against the colonial elite, right? And Bacon's Rebellion was put down very forcefully. And it kind of resulted in there becoming a legal distinction of white to separate the servant class on the basis of skin color and continental origin. So it was no longer that you were an Irish indentured servant, now you were a white indentured servant. And this is also the formation of how it went from indentured servitude to slavery. Well, it was already slavery, but in terms of the indentured servants being able to pay for their freedom, whereas the Black servants were never able to do that, and had to live generation after generation in slavery. But just even the fact that we've constructed whiteness, you know, it's not something that we're not born with an idea of it. And that is in and of itself is historical. But then when we look at the historical structures, so example being the way that Black women face discrimination in the healthcare system and are more likely to have their needs, their requests for painkillers, their childbirths not as easily, not as smooth, I guess, and just all these, we have a higher mortality rate within that and within Black women population. And one of the historical points of that is there was a time when the field of gynecology did a lot of its testing on Black women, on Black slaves. And so, you know, they were stretching us to our limits of pain to see what medicines worked, what the inside of the uterus looked like, so that they could make, and this, you know, before we did the whole animal testing thing, it was just testing on Black people. And it set up this situation whereby there's this myth of some sort that Black women don't feel pain in the same way. And that's why when we go to the hospital and say, oh, like this is very painful, it's treated as not as serious. Our tears don't feel as serious. And this is just a micro example, honestly. Like there are so many ways where if you trace back anything long enough, we created it. And we did it on purpose. And now we have to uncreate it. And I'm trying to think of a couple more that are just, I mean, redlining in and of itself was a target for getting the political party that you wanted in power, right? Like gerrymandering happens, oh, sorry, I was mixed up the words. Gerrymandering is about political power. And the result of gerrymandering specifically towards Black communities and also specifically towards mass incarceration is that you have a lot of rural communities in the US where prisons are located. but the prisoners themselves are disenfranchised. They can't vote while they are serving time, but their numbers count towards the local census. And so that rural community's political power is inflated in the national, even the way that they can get more representatives, they have more political power. And this, again, is a system, it's designed to do that. It's designed to, one, disenfranchise Black people, and also provide more political power to whites. And then when you look at, now I can actually transition to redlining, which was born out of fear. You know, it was, the slaves were freed and people did not want to desegregate. And so you create these policies whereby it makes it very difficult for a Black person to move into a white neighborhood. You check, you know, before we even invented credit, it was, and credit scores and credit checks, we had all these issues within the system to make it very hard for a Black person to get a home in a white neighborhood. And so, you know, when people say this neighborhood is ghetto, or I don't like going there, it's dangerous. I mean, that neighborhood was created that way with low resources and low education funding on purpose. And it's just self-perpetuates. It's yeah. Well, let me see. If anyone else wants to add to that, honestly, I guess raise your hand in the chat, and Isabel will unmute you.
Does anyone have anything to add? I'm going to have you go, Ayo, to the next question, which was from Michael. Let me unmute him, but it's how do we begin dismantling white supremacy culture? Let me find Michael if you want to add anything. There you go. You're unmuted. Are you?
Yeah. Thanks for unmuting me. Yeah. So obviously that's a very big and all-encompassing question. I'm thinking through how it applies specifically within my own work environment, which is white-led. And so how do you start dismantling a culture that has elevated, obviously it's white-led because the culture has propped up certain perspectives over other perspectives and certain behaviors over other behaviors. And so how do you even begin to address the need to change behavior to create a different culture when it's so nuanced and maybe even slight? There are slight things that kind of create the culture. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that
like having quantitative outcomes, for example, I really question that.
I don't think I'm going to be the person to answer that question for you. Because you're right, it is extremely difficult. How do you dismantle white supremacy? We've been asking for decades, centuries, who knows? And I think, you know, having conversations like this is very helpful. Information is powerful. But as we've just discussed, it's not just interpersonal racism that has to go. It's taking that information, having those conversations, and then taking political action. And, you know, it is about elections to some degree, because if the people that we've elected into power want to dismantle white supremacy, they can start. They're not going to complete it. It's, you know, it's not all political. Some of it is financial, right? So, and they can regulate the banking sector, they can regulate the real estate market in some way, but at some level we've seen that they can't regulate every single thing about these markets. And so it's even then the second level of economic activism. So where you send your dollars is very important as well to show what you care about. I mean, I see a lot of people saying, with all of the things that Amazon does, if we, the consumer, stop feeding Amazon, they will go broke. Like, we are the ones that give them power and money because we value the convenience of 2-day shipping. I love 2-day shipping, I do. And it's sad. Like that's the nature of the way our world works, is that we reinforce things with our money. And those are just some of the things that I do. I'm guessing that other people much wiser than me have philosophized on ending about how to dismantle the system. But in terms of what a single person can do, those are some thoughts. On a larger level, I do see the well-being economy as a concept is very instrumental to this as well. Because if we take as the baseline that we want every single human being to be able to achieve their needs on Maslow's hierarchy, we want everyone to be able to self-actualize and reach their potential, and have well-being, then, and if we take that into all the policy that we make to ensure that, then part of white supremacy is dismantled. But I think it's all incremental. It's all here and there and coming together ideally.
I'm gonna, thank you, Ayo. I'm gonna go also to Amanda next, because she had asked a question in the beginning and then wrote her question in the chat. And I think it might also provide some context or additions to what you're saying. So go for it, Amanda.
Yes. So, I mean, I put the question there, but around systemic racism also in our global economic system. So outside of, national economic systems, I think there's a lot we see of continuing colonial relationships that are under the guise of like free markets, working in international development. There is constantly this argument, particularly in Africa, around governments being too corrupt to be able to own their own resources or manage their own economies. And it's an argument you get there a lot more than other places. And we end up legitimizing, foreign ownership of spaces and sort of unfair trading regimes. So I think also thinking from a global perspective would be interesting to sort of discuss as well.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm trying to read the chat right now. We will share the document with you guys. And one of the things that I'm going to literally add now is the definition of Neo Colonialism, which is what Amanda has just described. But to get us a little bit all on the same page, if you're not as familiar with it, if you don't work in international development, neocolonialism is the practice of using capitalism, globalization, cultural imperialism, and conditional aid to influence a developing country. This is as opposed to the previous colonial methods of either direct military control or indirect political control. And so it differs from standard globalization and development aid in that it typically results in a relationship of dependence, subservience, or financial obligation towards the neocolonialist nation. And so this results in an undue degree of political control or spiraling debt obligations, functionally imitating the relationship of traditional colonialism. And this ends up as a result, we see that foreign capital is used for the exploitation rather than for the development of less developed parts of the world. And investment under neocolonialism typically increases rather than decreases the gap between the rich and the poor countries of the world. And so this is something, oh, she put it in the chat, wonderful. Oh my God, I love you, Isabel. This is one of those things that I relate to in a very visceral way. So I was born in Nigeria. Everyone constantly complains about how corrupt our government is. And I think even in the way that we see the dictatorships in South America play out, and our interactions in the Middle East, it's all under this neo-colonialist imperialist system that we've created, which kind of says you create a dependency on foreign capital to get anything done. So when I was working at PowerGen, one of the interesting projects that we applied for funding was with USTDA, which is the US Trade and Drug Administration. And the conditions for their funding, you have to make all these spreadsheets and show them all these things. One of the conditions for their funding is that you have a certain percentage of what you're going to spend their money on be US products. And so for a microgrid, this ends up being we'll buy US solar panels instead of the Chinese ones. which when you think about it, makes no sense. Like, why would you not give us money if we don't buy your products? and you kind of just see this in the way that another example is the Kenyan system, like the Kenyan railroad, for instance, was recently built with a lot of help from Chinese dollars. And what happened, well, right now it's somewhat, but the general concept is that a large foreign government will give money and kind of knowing that that country is going to be in debt, and then they regulate policy in that country based on that. They make your decisions for you, and it is white supremacist. And I don't know how to dismantle this one, but but I'm glad that we're talking about it, because it's something that I see as such an issue. Oh, Amanda has to go. I see it as such an issue in our world today, because we can't grow if you're still indebted. And it seems like a macrocosm almost of this things we see in the like American ghetto is you strip a community such that they are dependent on their oppressors. And then you ask them why they haven't thrived. It's like, what are we doing?
Yeah, I'm going to pause you because I want to kind of keep moving, because I think it's such a big topic. So there's a couple questions that I'm going to group a little bit and ask you to talk about them, maybe try to group them. So one of them is, what is it that drives and upholds white supremacy? Is it greed? And then one of them is talking about, how do you think allyship plays a key role in dismantling of white power structures and systemic racism? And then adding that with your own personal experience. So looking at, if you can make a connection between those three. So have your personal experiences of like the white supremacist model, like been different in different locations that you've lived? Maybe you could even talk about allyship as you've experienced it. But if you can couple those.
Okay, what was the first one again? Sorry.
No worries. It was just like, what is underneath it? Is it greed? What do you think the underlying?
Yes. What is underneath it? I think that human ego is underneath it. I think that, this is actually, I love this quote as well. Toni Morrison has this quote about some people who can only feel like tall when they have someone else on their knees. And I think that this isn't necessarily only true of those big, scary, bad people that we see. I think this is true of a lot of human beings, is that, we all struggle with our self-esteem and we all want to feel great. And if the systems around you indicate to you that you are great by virtue of your whiteness, it's hard to say no to that system. I think a lot of the systematic things are born out of greed and the way that money works, especially when we look at colonialism and just the historical factors that brought us here. I mean, like, slavery was about money. It was about cotton, and it literally built the wealth of America, right? And so greed plays a factor, but greed plays a factor in the same way that anyone likes money, because money is so instrumental to the way we survive in this society. And so, it's like saying, I think when we put these labels of like these virtue labels of greed, you kind of other it to say, like, I'm not greedy such that I cannot be bad in this way. But greed is human, at least in the way I see it. And I don't think it can just be pushed aside, or solved. But in terms of allyship, is to sit down with your greed, to sit down with your ego and dismantle it. Which is kind of contrary to everything I just said. But I guess it's more, I think that everyone is born with these things of, very human feelings. And you need to be able to fight yourself on them, to know, okay, and just the same way that when you're jealous about your partner, you say, okay, am I jealous or am I insecure? Sit down with that for a bit. Am I feeling, do I want to say this thing to this person that might be marginally racist, or am I feeling insecure? Like, ask yourself these questions. But I think allyship is, so much deeper than simply wrestling with yourself. We also, I'm just going to read the definition actually, because wonderful. But it's someone who makes the commitment and effort to recognize their privilege. And this can be based gender, class, race, sexual identity, and work in solidarity with oppressed groups in the struggle for justice. And allies understand that it is in their own interest to end all forms of oppression, even those from which they benefit in concrete ways. And allies commit to reducing their own complicity or collusion and oppression of those groups, and invest in strengthening their own knowledge and awareness of oppression. So I think this actually does tie a lot into my personal experiences, in that my most annoyed moments in the past few weeks have been when someone is like, oh my gosh, I didn't know it was so bad. Like, this is so crazy. I'm so distraught. And I'm kind of just like, well, honey, you didn't know it was so bad because it didn't affect you. Like, you want me, am I supposed to now take care of you and your feelings when I've been living all my life, living in this? Are you like what? So that's been a bit of a fun frustration. And I think a good ally is able to know when to put their feelings aside, know when to listen as opposed to speaking, and just generally know when to be wrong and be okay with it and change their mind. And I do think that, I mean, yes, if the entire world was full of allies, then we would have, quote unquote, no problems. I don't know. Like, it's a hard blanket statement to make, but it's like, if the entire world decided to be fully empathetic to all human struggles, perhaps. And I think that is the basis of good allyship, is to just sit in empathy, just dive into it, but not put yourself at the center of it. There's a website from Emma. Wonderful. We love that.
Without having you have to read all of the chats, because I think that can be a lot when you're speaking. I'm just gonna find something for you here. So one of the questions that Lisa had asked was, do you see a difference between white supremacy systems when you've lived in the US, when you lived in Europe, or versus when you were growing up in Nigeria, or were you in Kenya? Like, how have being in different places around the world, how has that shown up?
I feel like I didn't really develop a concept of race until I moved to the United States. I think in Nigeria, there is white supremacy, in that I went to a British school. So a lot of the African countries have, and also Indian, a lot of developing countries have this system whereby the good private schools, the one where all the diplomats and all the rich people send their kids, are modeled after European curriculum. So there's the British school, there's the German school, there's the American school, and they'll just, be in different parts of the city and around roughly the same tuition. So I went to British school, I went to Grange. I learned how to spell color with a U when I was first growing up. And the school itself was, majority Nigerian people, but there were a couple diplomatic kids. So one of my best friends was this Chinese kid named Richie. And I think because maybe just the nature of being in a country where you are the majority, I never really felt my Blackness. I always felt very okay, especially with my features, like my physical features. It's like everyone looked like me, so I was never insecure about how I looked. And then I came to America, and so many stories to tell. Well, part of the upbringing is that growing up in Miami, it's also a very immigrant community. So the people that I went to church with, the people I interacted with were, Cuban, Dominican, Haitian, Jamaican. And so a lot of the discrimination per se is on a nationalistic basis or on a colorist basis. You have the same people in the Dominicans and Haitians living on the same island and then not liking each other because one is a little bit more light-skinned. So that's part of the cultural landscape in South Florida. But even then, I think I still, the brunts of more in-your-face racism, or not that much, I would say. I think even there, I still felt largely comfortable. But I heavily thought that I was very ugly for a lot of my upbringing. Like I was like, my nose is too large. And I'm like, it was all, I tried skin lightening creams at the age of 12. And yeah, I think that I learned what Blackness was when I moved to the States, and I didn't think I liked it. There was also, there's this weird intersection between the African immigrants that come. I think a lot, and this is something I'm still talking to my own mother about. Oh, there's a police wagon, sorry. There's a sense of internalized racism there as well, where a lot of my family members call Black Americans akata, which is like a word denoting like trash. Like it's not good, it's not a good word. And there's this sense that like, we're not Black, we're African, like we're not those people who sag our pants and have tattoos. And even that, it's so sad, and like it's so heartbreaking. It's like something that I still have constant conversations with my own mother about, where you try to tell her about why we're all in this together. It's us against the white people, Mom. Like what are we doing here? But not against the white system. Whiteness is the concept. And I think the next sort of phase of that, Boston, like I went to the university in Boston, and I think there it was my first instance of of feeling very noticeably Black, in terms of not having that many other Black people around me. So it's like walking around, you just feel very seen all the time. And that's, I think also it's even truer of my experience in Stuttgart, is that I feel very uncomfortable if I go out of my house and I don't have my makeup done, or like I'm not wearing something well, because I know that I'm looked at very often. Because there's just, everyone else looks very similar other than me, like I just stick out. And these are all very internal things. It's like, these are not anyone stopping me on the street and calling me the N-word. Like, I don't think that's ever happened to me in my life, which I'm so grateful for. But it's all part of this like internalized own self-racism within myself, of like being like, I'm nervous in situations I shouldn't be nervous in, I'm uncomfortable when I shouldn't have to be uncomfortable. And I think I felt definitely, I loved my time in Kenya. It was, I think one of my favorite things was just all the different hairstyles of all the women there. And just feeling so comfortable exploring all facets of my beauty. And seeing, I think one of the biggest things you notice is like when you watch the news, it's like all Black people, and Black people outside of their stereotypes, Black people being intelligent, Black people being forthcoming, Black people leading and achieving, because the whole country is Black people, right? And so that is a very different way to see Black people than when you grew up in America. You see Black people in America as entertainers and athletes. That's what's on TV. And every once in a while you see Don Lemon. I love Don Lemon. But every once in a while you see him and you're like, I wonder, and obviously I always get the you talk like a white person. I've been getting that since I was like 6. I don't even, no, only when I moved to the United States. So let's say 9. I was 8 years old when I moved. And it's one of those things where people are so used to having a single definition of Blackness that when I don't meet that expectation, I'm no longer Black. And it's kind of like, I specifically always strive to define my Blackness for myself. And I think a little bit, as I talk to more of my other friends, they're working on doing similar things. All right, I'm done monologuing. Oh my God.
Does anyone else on the call have anything that they want to ask or share? I know, maybe some of you work for different organizations, and we sort of touched on that, but any stories or experiences that are coming up for anyone? Just to read what Robert said. He said, macro systemic systems and structures enacted and reinforced by deeply personal aspects of our lives. Feels like there's a lot of work to be done inside ourselves as a starting point to engage in more relational, external, institutional, structural change needed. Which I think sort of resonates with really what you just said. It was these internal dialogues. We have two questions. Racism exists in every culture across the world beyond just color, no? And then another one that says, do you think intersectionality is key in the current changes that we want to make?
Yes, intersectionality. When you say racism exists in every culture across the world, I'm not sure.
Can I put Eco World? I'm going to put you on off mute so you can elaborate a little bit on your question. I think I've unmuted you. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for arranging this wonderful Zoom conference. This is the first time I'm joining such a talk and sharing, and I think it's quite enlightening to hear views from our friends from across the world based on their personal experiences. I'm from Singapore. I am mixed heritage, what we call Eurasian. My mom's British, my father's Portuguese Ceylonese, and I was born in Singapore. And in a so-called mixed cultural setting like Singapore, that has been propagated to be very core multicultural, I'd have to share the rude awakening truth is that it's a very racist society that I live in, and I think I think that there's a lot of political agenda that capitalizes on this division and somehow intelligently are successful in keeping us comparing and competing against each other. And so I don't see, we are very empathetic about, for example, the latest episode that occurred with George Floyd. Me and my mates, we empathized about what happened. But however, we saw beyond the context of just Black Lives Matter. We saw a universal perception, because we could relate to what was happening in the US and and what's happening in Nigeria or in Africa for that matter. And it's happening in our own backyards. I think everything that we see happening across the world is what's happening in our own backyards. And so it's beyond color, it's beyond white supremacy, it's beyond Black Lives Matter. It's about all lives matter. And I think some of our friends who were sharing brought up a very important underlining factor that basically summarized as ignorance. I think people are very ignorant about what we have in common as human beings. And somehow I think it's very much embedded in our culture. If we want to bring in quantum physics possibly DNA embedded. And however, we have the choice as adults to listen to our conscience and realize that something is terribly wrong, that there's a lot of contradiction within ourselves. So this one of our
I think you're describing a lot of interpersonal racism and interpersonal prejudices that people hold, which, yes, we do need to do the work of dismantling, but I think that the moment right now, in terms of Black Lives Matter, is about working towards the systematic issues. So if we discuss, as you gave the example of Singapore, and yes, you know, there's the Chinese Singaporeans, the Indian Singaporeans, the Malay Singaporeans, and there's, you know, there are the intrinsic rivalries, it seems, but I wish you, I don't know much about the political system, but I imagine that there's a bit more level ground in terms of his like systematic abuse of one system, of one group against the other. And so we, like, absolutely, ignorance is a problem in this world. There's a lot of work to be done intrinsically within each of us, but I think there's a lot of political work to be done for all of us to take our political action and say, we will not allow redlining, we will not allow the disproportionate treatment of Black people in healthcare, in the judicial system, in various places. And we will not allow the disproportionate amount of funding to white startups, and, you know, all these things that are they are highly linked to color when you look at the systematic level, I believe. But yeah, absolutely, we should all do some more work internally within all our communities to address prejudice.
Yeah, thank you. So we've had, Michael said, I asked the white supremacy culture question earlier because there's an idea that culture eats policy for breakfast. And then we have another, Maria is going to ask a question. Maybe I will put Maria, I'm going to put you off mute here so you can speak and ask your question aloud. Is it? I'm also looking at the time and realizing that we have 5 minutes. So let me actually pause and just say that, I don't know, Ayo, do you want to do kind of a summary or wrap up and kind of give us like a bit of a conclusion, maybe something that we can take with us for ourselves and for the organizations, and how to deepen our own work on becoming more anti-racist? And yeah, any
a long list, isn't
it? or like, yeah, just wrap it in some nice, yeah.
I think we've touched on so many things that I'm surprised it's only been an hour, actually. And we all collectively, as I've said, need to do the work of dismantling within ourselves our own prejudices. Having this, so there's I think there's 3 layers, right? There's have a tough conversation with yourself, have a tough conversation with your friends and family, have a tough conversation with the political system. And those are it. The conversation can take many different forms. Maybe it's with your money, maybe it's with your time, maybe it's with your talents. But I think keep having it. That's the most important part, is to keep having it. And I saw someone posted about reparations, that we should all, I'm a pusher of that, only because we never got our 40 acres and a mule, never got it. Also, I say we, but definitely my family was still in West Africa at the time, but whatever. But yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think it's important to not get disheartened. It's important to see progress. It does feel like very little progress at times, I'll admit that, but it's important to notice it in your surroundings and notice it in yourself. and take those moments of joy and use them to inspire you to do more.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much, Ayo, for teaching us and allowing us all to listen today. Really, really great. I'm very appreciative of your time and insights. And for all of those that joined, thank you so much as well. I think this is at least the beginning, or this is something like, feels like our feet are on the gas, right? Like we have to keep pushing for these changes that we want to see in the world. And there is an intersection in all of our work where we can incorporate anti-racist policies or initiatives in every sector. It affects every single sector. So hopefully this gives you something to think about. If you all are not on the Citizens platform, do join, and we'll hopefully continue the conversation offline there. It's weallcitizens.org. This call will be recorded and reposted, and we've thought about potentially building a series of these events. So if that's of interest, I would love the feedback that you all have, either on our Facebook page or on any of our socials. You can tweet at us. It's at @weall_alliance. Yeah. And thank you all again. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your mornings, afternoons, and evenings.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. You are amazing. That was so great. Did
Wow.
you enjoy it? Oh, you need to unmute again. Okay.
Sorry.
Wow.
That was so
Yeah,
good.
that was good. That was really good.
Oh, we're still recording.
Oh,
That's okay. We have said nothing.
stop.